Hey everyone, this is the WG-KMS meeting number 15 for May 10th, 2022. Let's see, we have a cap and issues. What should we talk about? Has everyone had time to look at the cap? We're gonna bring it up for discussion tomorrow in the SIGOT meeting, which I believe is like the last one before either folks will be out or whatever. Like I think that's the last one we have to actually get feedback from the other leads. So has everyone looked at it? Or we at least in sync on what we're proposing to the rest of the group?
I haven't. Like I've looked at the document, but not at the cap yet. But yeah, I can have a look
It's
before tomorrow.
mostly the same, but I think there were a few things that got added since the doc. So I would say the doc is now, we can probably not look at the doc anymore. And
Yeah, actually,
yeah.
can you update the doc to say that it's been moved to the cap
Sure,
and
sure,
basically
sure.
force it to be
Absolutely.
read only, so that way.
Yeah, let me change it to read only.
Yeah, it's now we're in the
Yeah, that's a good
markdown sad phase of. No, I am a big fan of the what is it, the diagram. The diagram's really nice.
Yeah, the diagram is really nice. Good work.
Yeah, I think it makes it a lot more clear what spaghetti we're trying to talk about when we're like, I want a key hierarchy. I was like, where?
Next time we start with such a beautiful diagram, right?
Yes, I think that would have made some of the conversations a lot smoother.
No, but we had to go through the pain to figure out the diagram, okay? The diagram was a byproduct of a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Speaking of, I guess like let's look at the diagram because it's a lot more clear.
It's pretty dense. It's pretty dense.
Yeah, I mean, is there any contentions anywhere?
I like that the diagram shows basically all the flows in one. It does make it a little bit crowded, but in my head I was like, if we were to duplicate the diagram for like the alternative flows, I feel like people would lose the fact of like the only like this piece changes and the rest is the same. So I was like, I think it's better to leave it as is, even if it is noisy. And I have a suspicion that when others review it, they might be like, I don't understand what you're talking about here, because we've probably explained it at a level that is clear to the rest, the five of us that have been talking about this for a couple of months. But they'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Where did you come up with this word? Or anything like that. But I do think the diagram does clear up a lot of the specifics. I think the only like nit I had, which I don't even really think matters, is like there's some framing I think in the second diagram which says that like the API server will assume that key hierarchy like is not being used or something like that. I remember seeing something like that in one of the diagrams. I think maybe at the very bottom of this one. I just remember something about the API server making assumptions. I was going to say, I don't think the API server ever cares what you're doing. It's just sitting there shuffling the data that you gave it back to you, and you get to decide what it means, right? Because like basically, using metadata does not mean you're using a key hierarchy. Using metadata just means you asked us to store something unencrypted for you.
I think I had, we can assume. I don't think we said API server anywhere though.
Yeah, well, I mean, even then, for example, you can't assume that key hierarchies are being used, right? Because you could shove everything into the key ID if you wanted. We just don't want you to. Right? Like we're giving you a nice structured place to put your stuff. Put your stuff there, so that way, if a human, like the reason that metadata is split out is not because it's fully required. It's to provide
Make it cleaner.
It's to provide a place of structure so that way when a human being or the plugin has to go look at the state again, it's easier to reconstruct and they're not doing like byte parsing it. basically length offsets. Right? So it just makes it a lot easier, right? Like, but there's nothing preventing the key ID from being an entire protobuf serialized structure that has schema within it that is completely opaque to us, right? It's just that we're saying don't do that.
Right.
That's ugly. Please just don't. Instead, we're going to give you a schema that we think is sufficient for basically any realistic use case that we can come up with. And we hope that people use that instead. So that way, at least there's a little bit of standardization, right?
Yeah, I think there are certain assumptions. Like at least I think like the way we have the KEP and the diagram is that we are assuming that in metadata there is something which is like a local KEP, and that translates to key hierarchy. And I think like that's how we have it. And probably also going forward, if we document it like in terms of how reference implementation is used and all of that, maybe we encourage users to say like, hey, don't overload all of this in your current key ID, but rather put all of this additional data that you need in metadata, so you can have it in a nice manner. And I mean, after that, if the plugin maintainers still decide to go and overload all of that in current key ID, then you can't stop them from it. But yes, you're right. Like at least as part of the KEP, we are assuming this. And I think like one good thing is in the entire KEP, we make the same set of assumptions, like even in the sequence diagrams or wherever we actually document the flow, like I think we make the same assumption that if you have something in metadata, which signifies a local key, then we're just assuming that's what you're using for key hierarchy.
Right.
That reminded me of a thought I had a while back. The UID that we pass through from the API server, would we want to write that down as a specific field? Like, would we want to persist it in storage? So like it would be generated on the encryption request, sent through to the plugin, and it can do whatever it wants. But when the response comes back, the encrypt response comes back, would we want to store that UID that we sent through as a field in the proto that we field, right? So kind of thing, is that useful? Like would it because what it would do is when you read the data, if you were doing like data mining or whatever, and you were just reading etcd fields, you would see that and be able to say, okay, I can take this UID and find my KMS logs and like one-to-one trace like the encrypt, like I can get back to basically the encrypt operation, right? And or if you have like cloud KMS logs or whatever, and they're storing that, you could say that this piece of data is 100% correlated with that event. Like I think we're already basically saying you can correlate the key, like the cloud KMS key, because that's part of the API. I guess I'm asking if we think that the UID being stored also would be valuable.
And I'm assuming when we actually do want to store UID, it's basically the Cube API server already having the UID. So it's just going to put that into the protobuf and store it, right? Like it's not going to depend on the KMS plugin to return it as part of the encrypt response.
Yeah, the only change would be to the proto format that we're storing on disk. It would not be a change to encrypt request or encrypt response. I mean, they're kind of already fine. It's just, do we think that it would be valuable to also store that durably? Like, I just want to make sure that we're not missing some debugging use case or whatever where it would be helpful to just keep that around. Like it's not expensive, right? It's a couple of bytes, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense to store it if it's not valuable.
I wonder if it's really meaningful to store it. Like, couldn't you just get the same amount of information by, let's say, log encryption request in the API server directly and output like an object ID, for example, with the UID, but without storing the UID itself. And then if you ever want to introspect like what happened with this particular object, you will have like the object ID from etcd, and you can go to your API server logs and see what is the actual like UID of the encryption request that occurred, and then like go on and on to the KMS logs.
I think you are correct. The only like thought I had as you were saying that is basically I think you can piece together like we've given you enough to piece together all the puzzles if you're very good about basically retaining every log from like every source, right?
Yeah.
Which is I guess fine. Like you probably should, right? You shouldn't throw away stuff. But if we did store it in the proto, we know you're going to keep the proto around because that's etcd. That's guaranteed to be persistent because it's required. That means the only other thing that you probably have to record is cloud KMS, right? Like your final external KMS, right? If you record it there, you basically can say, well, like I know in etcd, the one place that has this UID is this secret in this namespace, right? And like, you know, you can kind of look at that and be like, okay, well, I know this is how it was correlated, right? So your external KMS would have timing and all that information, and you can kind of correlate it back really easily. So in a sense, it reduces a small, I think, operational burden, which is you no longer have to correlate Kubernetes API server logs with Cloud KMS logs. You just look at your persistent storage for etcd, and if you bother to store it on your external KMS, it's gonna be a pretty easy link. So maybe that's compelling. It's certainly not hard, right? Like that is one of the beauties of actually using proto storage is adding a field is like I just add the field. It's fine. Like I don't have to like bit fight my way to it.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is there will be no history, right? Like if there's multiple operations performed on a secret, like it's being encrypted, decrypted like multiple times for some reason, like it's always a cache miss, then the UID that's persisted is only the last one. So as a user, if I only rely on etcd data, then I'm not seeing the entire data.
That's true.
I'm only seeing the latest operation on the secret.
I can see the pros and cons of having it. I mean, there's also like what happens when the logs are rotated, right? So, but again, like you said, you only get the last one, the last write.
I mean, technically, you know, we could be fancy and keep like the last 10 somehow. Like I'm not saying that would actually be like a significant implementation effort. Like it would be hard, right? Because you'd have to pull the data out and like I don't know, store it on the context somehow for a bit and then reuse it later. It'd be kind of rough. Maybe let's just, Rita, do you mind making a comment saying that just on the KEP so we can just bring it up and see if
Sure.
anyone cares. I honestly, I'm not even sure if I would bring it up. It might just be a comment that's there, and then I think there's much bigger questions to talk about tomorrow. Like, for example, are people okay with having a brand new V2 API?
Right.
That goes through the full, like that's actually the biggest ask, right? It's like, I want to make a new API. You all agree that we should make a new API?
Yep. I mean, there's a lot, like you said, there's already so much in this KEP. I rather that we focus on the biggest items that we need to get in.
Yeah.
Like this UID thing, I think we can probably bring up even later.
Let's not even bother commenting.
Yeah.
It's
so tiny compared to everything else.
Yeah. So if we look at it, the big asks are, I want a V2 API. It's going to have a brand new proto storage format, distinct from any other thing. It's going to have a complete reference implementation that we are basically signing on to maintain forever. We being the SIG. What else?
We have new
fields.
Yeah,
we have new storage semantics from basically the KMS plugin, whereas previously it was limited, right? The amount of data it could send back to you was significantly limited because it had to fit into how many, I think 256 bytes or something like that, because it was length prefix, right? But it only gave it like 2 bytes to fit the length in, right? So whatever the max that you can fit in is the length, right? So yeah, that's a pretty big ask. Hold on one second.
I'm wondering, like, since we are changing the API, have we considered extending the reference implementation to also support the previous API so that actual implementers can more easily be backward compatible with their previous version? Because like if we just tell them, hey, you need to update your plugin to use the reference implementation so that you will have access to more features, we have to also provide them ways to still support what they used to support, which is basically the previous API.
Sorry, I just missed everything you said, Damien.
No, it's not. Yeah, no, I was just wondering because, like, for me, the reference implementation, as we've talked about, is focused on the new API. But
Yes.
the actual user of this reference implementation might be existing plugins developers that have to support the previous API as much as the new one in order to be backward compatible with their like previous versions. So do we want to provide that? Like, is it in our scope?
I would say no, because the ability to migrate from the beta API to the V2 API is, while tedious, is totally sort of within what the server already supports. Right? That's why the encryption config proposes a brand new spot for the V2 API. It doesn't mess with the V1 at all. And like one of the implementation requirements I'm going to sort of assert for this is we literally do not touch those files at all. We just leave them alone, right? Because there's no way to regress that if you just leave it alone and you, right? Like I rather copy paste stuff out of it and just say it sucks that we copied stuff, but instead of like touch it or refactor it or do anything to like reuse it, because it doesn't have nearly as much test coverage as it should. Like it has some, but I don't feel confident. So I would rather just leave it alone and make a nice thing. But yeah, I do think what our recommendation should be is when we're asking people to migrate is to basically build a brand new plugin using the reference implementation, like new in the sense of like basically just use the thing we gave you for free and run both, right? So add go ahead and start running the V2 one alongside your beta one and migrate at whatever speed that you're comfortable with, right? And like I know I said 3 releases before V2 goes GA, before beta is removed. That to me is the minimum, right? Like if folks feel like 6 is better, that's fine. Hell, even if you say 9 or 12 is better, whatever, right? Like the point is I rather put a point in time where we say it's going to be gone so that there is an end time, but 3 means 1 year. I think that's the absolute minimum we should provide people, right? So that way, they could, if it takes them 1 release to get a GA implementation ready for their provider, and then they hook it in as a read thing on that 2nd release, then on the 3rd release, they can put it as a write thing, right? And then all they have to do at that point is just run storage migration, right? Sort of blindly, and only the new V2 thing will be used at that point, right? And they can sort of swap it out. Right, and that's why to me it's like the minimum, both from like the Kubernetes API standpoint of removing, like beta doesn't have nearly as strong of a requirement for leaving it around, but this beta API is just like PSP. It's been around for a super long time and it hasn't changed, so it's effectively the V1 API, right? And removing it is fine, but you have to basically pretend like it was V1. So I do think we're providing enough to migrate, but if we can make it even easier, I don't know. Like certainly what you could imagine is like a shim that would take the V1, sorry, the V2 API as input, translate it into the V1 beta one, and like you put that shim in between your old beta implementation and this. Like if we think that that's valuable enough to build, we can build it. Then basically what we're saying is you don't actually have to migrate at all. You can just run the shim forever.
Yeah.
You just
Yeah, I was
probably
mainly
won't get
wondering
any
because I
different.
was like, yeah, if people have to rewrite all the plugins that have been written so far, like it will take a while for like actual users of our implementation to start growing, like the user base to start growing.
Yeah.
But yeah, if like the reference implementation provide like enough like data to just be extended easily, then it's fine to just rewrite the plugins, I think. But yeah, it really depends on how it looks like at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a shim would be too hard to write. I just don't know if people would use it, like if they would, because you still have to deploy it, right? You still have to deploy it alongside, right? It basically would be another Unix domain socket that translates to the existing Unix domain socket that's already running, right? And so you would change your config to use that the other one, and I mean, I think the APIs are similar enough that you could stub out pieces, right? Like your status would basically return static data. It'd basically say it's always healthy, and the key ID is basically none, that there is none. You know, it would be non-empty. Like I think our validation would require that key ID is always non-empty, but you know, nothing prevents you from putting in a static value that just never changes.
Yeah. Also, you're thinking about it, like if we allow them to put static values for the status, for example, like it will kind of like go against the idea of like improving observability of like the plugins as a whole. Like it will go against the idea of like improving the plugins completely from what we've been trying to solve. Because like if we provide them a solution that is too easy, they won't really look at what were the improvements that we tried to make.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's maybe also a point that we want to consider.
Yeah, I mean, so I know GKE has an implementation. I think EKS does too. I don't remember Anish, does Azure have one? I assume it does.
Yeah, I think
So there's the cloud, the three cloud providers have one. OpenShift does not have at least a KMS implementation. It's not the KMS based approach. I don't remember. I think maybe IBM had something, but like there's not that many. There's not that many of these implementations.
I think we should present it at least, you know, after the presentation, assuming everybody else in the SIG is okay with this, then we can actively ping people from those plugins and invite them for feedback. Like I don't think we should spend too much time on this unless people are coming to us and say, hey, this is unacceptable.
That's fair. That did remind me of a question I had for y'all. Who's presenting tomorrow? This thing. Who's gonna be talking about it? I'm looking at you, Rita / Anish. Who's volunteering to follow on the sword?
Is this on the SIGOT call?
Say what?
Yeah. SIGOT
You mean
call,
on the SIGOT call?
Yes, I do mean on the SIGOT call, and I think Anish, you're still in India right now, right?
Yeah.
So it's like way too late at night for you to even show up.
I will show up, like I'm doing Eastern hours, so I'm usually available from 9 to 2 PST.
Okay, so it's within the scope, but like it's still really awful.
No,
like,
I'll be there. I can. Okay, I can present it.
Okay, that's fine.
I mean, and I hope that all of us would be there in case there are questions and just jump in whenever. So
Right. Yeah, no, I will certainly be there. I don't miss the SIGOT meetings hardly ever. It's more of someone would be presenting and answering maybe the bulk of questions, and then maybe we would jump in if they asked, or we felt more contextually aware of the thing. Oh, that also reminds me, the other big thing is the rotation piece. So you also, I'm sure, have seen that I dropped the whole stored version hash. And the reason that was dropped is because when I went to API machinery, they said we plan on deleting that field. So don't use it. So I was like, okay, I guess I can't use that one because that's not helpful to use a field that will get deleted. But the reason they plan on deleting is because the other API is the one that they're proposing as the replacement, and that one doesn't have the coordination issues. It's meant to be a place that your HA API servers individually state their opinion about the world in. And the diff that basically I had in here is basically saying that I want another field where API servers can also state their opinion. Maybe it's okay, maybe not. How did folks feel about that part of the KEP? It's a little iffy now because of the fact that we don't have a good spot to put the data. The API we're talking about, this one right here, what is this thing called? The storage version status. It's an alpha API, right? So it's a feature gated alpha API that's been stuck in alpha for a while because API machinery is busy and no one's picked up this particular piece of work. And it's a relatively hard implementation. So it might be a while before it moves forward. But yeah, basically, there's already semantics for what is the API version that a particular API server wants to use for writing, and what are the versions you can read. And then there's a separate field that basically says, do all API servers currently agree on how they want to write data? Right? Meaning that you can run a storage migration and it'll get consistent results. Right? And this basically says the same thing for key IDs, right? What particular key ID is each API server say it's at, and is that key ID the same across all API servers, right? When that's true, you can run a storage migration to cause rotation encryption at rest to be rotated correctly. So semantically, it's easy to describe, but it relies on an API that you can't rely on realistically. And it's basically saying, I'm going to piggyback on a thing that's not done. And hence why there's that big old note saying that rotation will not be part of the graduation criteria. It'll just be part of like testing, but we can't make it part of the graduation criteria because that means we can't graduate this thing until the other thing graduates. And I didn't want that. That seemed like the wrong outcome.
Yeah, I think like rotation isn't part of the API anyway, so we can move forward with it at any time. Like we have not like an urge to finish it before like the KEP goes beta or whatever. It's more, yeah, we have to do it at some point.
I almost want to, I also, because of this, right? Like I almost think maybe the rotation should be broken out of this KEP just to make it more clear this one is purely for performance and, observability. And the rotation, yes, we introduce it here, but, we don't track rotation until something more long-term is available for us to actually, use it and actually push it out for beta and GA or stable. This feels kind of weird to be part of this KEP, to be honest.
So I don't know if without the rotation piece, if you can really justify having like a key ID in the API, right? It doesn't really have a meaning then. Like that's why it exists, is to make the rotation possible. So like at the bare minimum, you basically have to say that I want to support rotation very soon. So I've built the API to support it. Right. And at that point, basically what I'm saying is if you build the API with rotation in mind, and that's important to you, you should still be able to write a test that runs against a single API server that works correctly always, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's sufficient, right? If we did that and we were writing tests against a single API server and basically describing the steps of storage migration, it should give us what we want. We should be able to rotate even with a key hierarchy in place correctly.
Maybe I should add that to graduation criteria, maybe.
Yeah, and to be fair, we don't need graduation criteria at the alpha level,
For right
right?
now, yeah.
Like that's why I kind of stripped out some of the stuff where I was like, I'm not sure how to exactly describe this yet, and I rather at least get a little bit of code written and some experience with the actual implementation, and then try to make sense of stuff.
That's fair.
But yeah, I do agree it's weird though, because if this API was done, the storage version status API, then this wouldn't be weird at all, right? We basically just saying, I want to add 2 fields there. Y'all okay with me adding 2 fields?
Yeah. Okay. Anything else we should discuss in terms of next steps? Because you know, I think that feel free to review it, asyncly, right? I think, where are we in terms of these particular issues and what's everyone doing? What's the status?
I have not made progress on my thing. I was going to ask if let's say we talk with SIGAUT folks tomorrow and the feedback is positive, and folks are likely to approve the KEP, etc. How do we want to proceed with like actual changes? Like one thought I had was that basically one of us would make a very small, like silly change somewhere to make a branch and make a PR with it against KK. And then we would all just keep making PRs against that branch and then merging them in, right? Like basically as a feature branch, right? Like we need to work together, but we can't merge this in like tiny pieces, right? Like the stuff has to like work as some cohesive whole before it goes in. So something like that probably is what I was imagining. So that way we don't block each other much, but at the same time, we're not trying to merge something half done into the API server.
So there's the V2 proto change that could be on its own, right? And then there's the status one, right? Or the one that this one, right? That can be on its own, right?
Maybe. The bits that you have to, I think, do before any of that is like the feature flags.
Okay, right.
Right, because they used to. That's the annoying thing, right? Like this API already has like 2 different feature flags that it kind of coordinates with. Now we're gonna add a third one. We'd be like trifecta of like, if you have this feature flag and this other feature flag and also this other feature flag, then you can use this field. So it's gonna be a little bit messy. But yeah.
Should I add that? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think this is the tricky part, because I think when dual stack was added, it was like a huge PR, like about 10K lines, and it took months to review it, like just before release. So we can either go with the approach of just producing a mega PR with all of the changes just in different commits, like each commit individually addressing a certain area, or if we can do it in phases, like breaking it down where we add the proto API and individually just keep getting it in. I think as long as we are certain that we will get all the changes in for 125, we can break it up into individual PRs Otherwise, there's just going to be code there, which was meant to be for 125, but it's not yet complete.
Yeah, I think what we could try to do to at least not necessarily de-risk the effort, but de-risk the code base is we could defer like the final wiring till like the end of the release. So the idea being is like we could have like, you know, a sister folder to the beta API, that's the V2 Alpha 1 API, and be working in there and making changes and even writing tests and everything. But if we don't build a wiring from the outside to come consume it, it doesn't matter that it's there, right? Because you can't use it as an external consumer yet. So that gives us basically the bulk of the release to like sit there and futz with at least unit level tests, right? It's basically when you want to get to the integration test bit, then you have to have the wiring in front, so that way you can actually run it like a real API server would. And then you're at the phase where it is risky, right? Because you have wired up something into the API server, and if it's incomplete, then it's a risky feature.
Fun.
Yeah, but yeah, I do agree with you, Nish. I suspect it's going to be at least a little bit like the whole dual stack thing, right? Where it's just going to be a massive PR. Yeah.
And hopefully we get that PR out sooner, so that, yeah, the last minute reviews were just like really hard with that dual stack one.
Yeah, no, I agree. If we could try to somehow have like the more code gen-y stuff in first, like, you know, there's that script for keeping the code gen up to date and those things. If we get that stuff in first, that's mostly boilerplate, right? But it increases the size of the PR significantly. So if we could probably do that stuff first, you know, get things cleaned up there, probably get that merged without too much fuss, and then actually try to consume it afterwards. That might break it up a little bit. But maybe this is a little bit too forward thinking because our KEP is not approved. So it just, they're like, yeah, we're going to implement everything.
That's true. But if it does get approved, it's all hands on deck, right?
Yes, yes. It's gonna take some significant effort to get. At least the reference implementation doesn't have to initially track any Kubernetes release. We can work on it on the side and just make a PR that basically says, "Here's a giant reference implementation. Take it. You'll like it.
Just take it."
Maybe not like that. Whoever's going to review it might not appreciate it. Yeah.
So what I would try for the reference library, I would try to finish as much as possible by tomorrow before the KMS meeting, and just you have a pull request which can be reviewed, and everything that's not within the pull request, I would just create new issues out of it, so others could pick it up.
How is that going, Christoph?
Oh yeah, it's definitely, it was definitely confusing, but the sequence diagram have helped a lot. So I think it should work now, but I still need to write the tests to verify that everything works as expected according to the sequence diagram. So this is an old pull request that didn't work with the current key ID and observed key ID, and at the very bottom, the last comment was about adding the new one. And what's really interesting for me, especially from people who worked on the remote KMS, would be how should the interface look like to them, right? I just said basically there's an interface where at some point I'm handing over a current key ID, and I hope that the upstream people know what to do with it.
Yeah, probably Anish has the most context on at least the Azure one.
Sorry, what was the question?
The Go interface for abstracting away arbitrary external cloud KMSs, basically, right? So it has to be able to represent like a hardware KMS, like PKCS 11, but also be able to represent cloud KMS. So like it probably has to be, yeah, the input parameters for like local tech and stuff are easy, but it's not as clear to me as like, for example, in the Go standard library, the encrypt and decrypt interfaces in there, the last parameter to them is empty interface, right? And that's basically meant to be like contextual options for the encryption that are dependent on what encryption is actually happening. I don't know if we need something like that, but I could imagine us needing that, right? As a way of passing in, I don't know, like maybe Cloud KMS needs like a project ID or something, and it needs to be passed in as a parameter on the side or something like that. I don't know. So that, I think that would be important to suss out. We could certainly take some learnings from the existing V1 Beta 1 integrations, right? We could kind of see how those different existing implementations interface with their Cloud KMS to get an idea of like, well, here's the bare minimum you need to be sufficient for the 3 existing implementations that we're aware of that are public.
Yeah, I think at least for the Key Vault one, I think the file that Rita has opened, right? Like we have a pretty simple interface. Like for encrypt, like we take in the context, and then for the Key Vault client, all we really need is the key ID and like an auth client that we use. But I think
but that's in the constructor, right? It's not actually in the function. Right. It's already like sort of closed. It's closed on those inputs already.
Right.
Okay, so in that sense, it might not. So the bare minimum would be just an encrypt and decrypt interface with context and the.
Yeah, and then basically the plain text or the ciphertext.
Yeah, and the metadata, right? Because now we have metadata.
Yes.
Right.
Who can forget? Oh, look, we're saying cipher everywhere. Yay!
Yeah, I know we're not good at using the right terms.
Well, I googled it, and some places they literally say cipher is like ciphertext.
Yeah, no, it's English is hard, but I rather use the right terms, at least in our APIs, even if we can't get our variable names right. Yeah.
Okay. What? So the reference implementation is gonna live in this repo?
Well, right now it can live wherever we want it to live.
I mean, right now it's gonna be in this repo.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sounds good.
It's not clear to me if the reference implementation would be in the staging of KK and then synced out to some other repo, or if it would be in a separate repo. The reason being is I think right now the gRPC API for KMS is like stored inside of Kubernetes. It's not like published anywhere, right? So like I think people literally copy that file, the proto file, and use it, right?
Right.
And that seems stupid. I don't understand. Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you make it something that you could import and use directly? So it seems like it should be in staging. So that way it's synced out from KK, and then you can consume it without literally vendoring all of KK into your code base.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like
the proto.
Oh, okay, so the proto is inside the API
module.
server. So
Yeah.
It's a smaller thing to vendor in, but not
Well, it's better than copying.
Yes, it is better than copying. Okay, so that's not terrible.
But I know what you mean. Like I think initially I did copy it.
Yeah.
Because it was easier. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay, cool. It's fun.
Okay,
right.
Anything else we should talk about before we close it out? And please ping us if when you want us to review the PR, I guess. And anything else we need to track between now and tomorrow.
No, I think we're good. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna just ask, so are we updating cipher to ciphertext in the proto and
Yes.
the KEP?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We want to do things right. Yes.
Yes, let's totally do that. And again, right, like at least for now, the KEP is very much a living document, right? We should iterate and keep it up to date. And also, I'm a big stickler on this. As we do implementation, if it drifts from the KEP, you take the KEP to match the implementation. You don't let it go stale. It's nice to be able to tell someone, look at, if you read this KEP, you will understand what we have implemented because it matches, it hasn't diverged. So, but you know, let's hope that other folks are as open to such a large change before we get too worried about how we're going to coordinate this change.
All right, y'all. It's ciphertext now.
So is plain becoming plain text, or it's still going to be plain?
Oh God.
Yeah, you got to update both places, Rita. You got to very carefully read every field and be like, is it exactly correct?
Oh no. Okay. Seriously though, all jokes aside, should I change it to plain text? I guess we
Yes.
should be consistent now. Okay.
Yes, let's be.
All right. Fine. Anything else? Please say.
Also in the sequence diagram, so the cipher.
I already did. I already did. Yeah.
Oh.
Way ahead of you on that one. Anything else?
I'm really digging the new support for diagrams where you don't actually have to make a picture and stick it in your KEP and fight with updating the picture.
Good. I'm totally gonna use that in the future.
Yeah.
So even when they reject the KEP, we introduce Mermaid to the folks.
Yeah, that's true. We'll take it, right? Even if they say our KEP is bad, we'll be like, but our diagram was really nice, y'all.
What? Because that's so funny.
When in the later phases, when if we start looking at graduation criteria and stuff, if you look right there on line 157 and 158, I had written some assumptions. We would probably want to actually validate those using like actual data.
Which one? Which one? Sorry.
157 and 158.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It basically says that implementing the key hierarchy in the KMS plugin optionally is a valid approach. I mean, that's basically what that one is saying. And the reason we believe it to be valid is we believe that the performance overhead is caused by network requests to an external KMS, not the gRPC layer, right? And we saw some of that with some of this work Anish had done, but we haven't really measured it with like a large cluster where there's like 10,000, 100,000 secrets or whatever, right? We sort of compare the old and the new. That'd be at least something we would want to manually do to suss out that, like, yeah, like if you can use a key for like a local KEK for like 1,000 operations, is it enough to like dramatically reduce the load on the external KMS?
You actually bring up a good point. Like for plugins that don't necessarily need these enhancements, they're forced to upgrade to V2, right? Even though they may not need it. I mean,
I think all the three cloud ones do, right? Like they should use the key hierarchy to provide significant performance improvements, or we believe it will. I think even in the case where you don't need the key hierarchy, migrating an implementation to the reference one, I think could still provide significant value, right? Because we'll start it out with some feature set, but then enhance it with more over time. And so you're basically like gonna get it, like it. Yeah, if you're purely happy with what you have and you just don't want to change it at all, then yes, you're right that we're basically creating work for you. Though, if you really feel that way, you probably should just write a shim adapter between your old plugin and the new API, and basically like do do no work really, like just build a shim. Instead of trying to update to any reference implementation. But I think what we would want to say is that none of this code is truly static, right? You know, software maintenance is a significant cost, and what we're saying is, if you're willing to pay an upfront cost of migrating to the new thing, then you get to leverage a community-built solution that's going to be kept up to date. So reduce your burden that way. But yeah, it is an ask. We're not. It's not free, right? You're not getting anything for free here.
Yep.
You're gonna have to work for it.
Okay, anything else? If not, we'll see you tomorrow.
Well,
See you tomorrow. Bye.
All right, bye.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye.
Right.